All right, hello. So I'm here with King Crocoduck, and we're talking about skepticism, the future of the West, and just general takes on the modern world. I should apologize about this live stream. We had scheduled it for a few dates, and it kept on moving around, largely because either me or Crocoduck was busy. So we finally got it consolidated to change the time at the last moment, just so it could fit into the schedule. Crocoduck, thanks for coming on. Do you want to give an introduction to your channel?
Sure. So I'm part of the Skeptic community, TM, RTM, TM. I make science videos, mainly just teaching science, debunking pseudoscience. Got a few series. But I am one of the YouTube atheists, been around for a reasonable bit of time. Been around, I think, longer than most of the people today who call themselves YouTube atheists, but I'm not like part of the Thunderfoot, Aaron Ra, Potholer 54 wave. I came a little bit later, but I've still been around for a while.
So can you the skeptic community is kind of an interesting term because people like Sargon of Akkad have spent a lot of time denying that such a community even exists. So maybe you could provide some background, what it is to you, what you think it really comprises.
Yeah, anyone who says there's no skeptic community, with all due respect to them, they're kind of full of shit. You have a bunch of people who are out there discussing ideas. There's a critical discourse taking place. Ideally, this would be the only thing that's going on. You wouldn't have any drama or bullshit or any lolcows, but we are human beings, and so we are prone to malice and error. So obviously some bullshit is going to creep in. But I think that the distinguishing feature of the skeptic community is that it doesn't come prepackaged with any conclusions. I don't think that it's necessary to say, you know, I'm an atheist or I'm an anti-SJW or any of these things to be part of the skeptic community. I think you just have to be part of this ongoing critical discourse.
But is it an ideology, or is it just sort of like a methodology? Because
yeah, it's a methodology.
Could a communist be a skeptic? Could a Nazi be a skeptic?
Yes. In principle, anyone can be a skeptic as long as they participate in this discourse. As long as they're in the business of critically appraising ideas, and just not taking things on board. These kind of a priori, taking things on fiat. Is kind of the antithesis of what it means to be part of this community. So I would consider somebody like both you, who is not an atheist, and ContraPoints, who is not an anti-SJW. I would consider the both of them part of the skeptic community. As long as you
broad, right? Because you could include people like Jean-Francois Gariepi as a skeptic, and under that definition, right?
Yes.
Okay, I mean,
yes.
but we've now created an umbrella term that includes communists and fascists and capitalists and socialists, and I guess
yes.
If we're all doing skepticism, if this is a methodological umbrella, I'm perfectly fine with it.
Yes, I think that's really this is really key. What a lot of people don't get about the skeptic community, and I'm glad you're using the term methodology, is that it's all about the methodology. It's all about the process. It's not about reaching a conclusion that we all agree with. It's about, if you respect the process, you are you are part of this community.
But is this process just the scientific process?
Not necessarily. I don't make really too broad of a distinction between a scientific process and a philosophical process done well. I see these things in the kind of Quinean way where they exist on the same spectrum. You have this dialectical method where in philosophy you have philosophers with their ideas and they're crashing their ideas against each other. Yeah. And with science you also have a dialectic, except your dialectic is with nature.
Well, I mean, in science it's fundamentally an empirical test, whereas in philosophy, for the most part, you're testing things logically and rationally for coherency.
Right. When I say dialectic with nature, that's just a poetic way of saying empiricism.
Well, I mean, maybe, right? I mean, a lot of very important natural theories were not developed empirically. Relativity was not developed empirically.
I
guess you could say it was inspired by like the Michelson-Morley experiment or whatever. But it was certainly not. I mean, when Einstein got the Nobel Prize for physics, they didn't give it to him for relativity because
it was for the photoelectric. Yeah,
they couldn't verify it. So this theory was what? Pardon me.
Wait, did you say they couldn't verify what?
They couldn't verify relativity at the time that they gave Einstein the Nobel Prize.
What year did they give? Didn't they give it in the 1920s? I forget.
Let's actually look this up. I don't know, but they didn't have experimental evidence on relativity to general relativity. It's 1921. They didn't have good experimental predictive evidence for relativity until I believe the 40s.
I think I disagree with that. I think it was in 1919 when the famous experiment was done. Sir Arthur Eddington went down to Africa to see the solar eclipse, and he was able to see that the predictions of whatchamacallit, it's gravitational lensing is not the term I'm looking for. It's he saw the bending of the starlight in the background of the eclipsed sun, because during the solar eclipse, actually, the opportunity to see one, the famous one a couple months ago, when it reaches totality, you can actually see the stars behind the sun. It grows sufficiently dark for that to be possible, and you can see the stars, their relative position with respect to one another shifts by a very tiny amount.
No, I understand the effect. I wasn't aware that had been done before he got the Nobel Prize. But I'm actually now surprised that he didn't get the Nobel Prize for general relativity if he had experimental evidence. But at any rate, we acknowledge the fact that the theory was developed prior to the experimental validation of it. It was done largely to reconcile the Maxwell equations, right? We agree on that, right?
Yes. Most of the time, it's worth considering, where did the Maxwell equations themselves come from? You have this ongoing back and forth between these deductive methods in mathematics and these inductive and abductive methods in science. But with Maxwell's equations, you have Faraday's mutual induction. Faraday, of course, he didn't know any math. He never did a single line of algebra in his life. He was a great experimentalist, though.
Yeah.
And the results he produced, Maxwell took these empirical results and was able to codify them in these mathematical terms. You have Ampere's law, of course. This was also, I think Ampere did actually derive a version of it. And this also comes empirically. And then you have Gauss's laws of no magnetic monopoles, which maybe there are, who knows? And the other one.
Well, if there are, we can take all of our physics and toss it in the garbage can.
Yeah. Well, let's not talk about it. Shh, it's a secret.
We actually have observed quote unquote anomalous magnetic monopoles, but because they were unreplicatable, we've dismissed them as being instrumental errors.
Yeah, they don't count. There's another version. I forget the details.
I always bring that up when people say that they don't understand what a non-repeatable event is.
Yeah. Well, there's actually another example. I forget exactly how it goes, but if you have a superconductor in a certain configuration, you can produce an artificial magnetic monopole, but it doesn't really count.
Well, but I think they just mean a magnetic monopole with like poles that go to infinity or whatever, right?
Perhaps. I
have
to
an asymptotic monopole, right, or something like that.
Yeah. It's been a while. I have to brush up on my E&M, but
yeah. Well, I actually do. I'm a bit of a quote unquote scientist myself. I do math. I do engineering, math, and statistics.
It's aeronautics, right? You do aeronautics?
No. I do stuff like global optimization research.
Ah, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's mostly probability math, stochastic processes, that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I mean, that's a very broad view of the skeptic community. When I was a bit younger, I was into the whole science war type things. But insofar as my scientific ambitions and my political ambitions have or my philosophical ones have crossed, I kind of lost interest in that because I felt that really when it came down to scientific questions, there really wasn't a large intersection with the big issues we deal with that divide the country. And that what divides the country right now, they're mostly questions about education and value. And to the extent that they actually intersect with science, they intersect with like soft sciences that don't have this really firm, rigorous framework in place.
Yes, and I'm one of the people on YouTube. I haven't been quite as vocal about it, but I have been advocating a naturalization of the social sciences, a means of embedding the social sciences within a naturalistic framework. So that way, we would these kind of questions would be open to genuine, rigorous inquiry.
I don't know. How is it not already? I mean, the problem is the data, not the name we give it, right?
Well, let's consider, for example, what's going on in a lot of the humanities and social sciences. This social constructionist paradigm. This is embedded.
This isn't the problem. There's several problems with social sciences, and I think I don't know if this is okay. There is the replication crisis, and then there's the repeatability crisis. The first one is that their sample sets are so small because of the human studies requirements, the Institutional Review Board requirements. IRB, as they call it, that you could basically do a social science project again and never be able to replicate the same results. The other one is, the repeatability crisis. And I don't know, for people who don't know statistics, the comic XKCD kind of made fun of this, right? Where the guys ask, like, if jelly beans cause acne, and they do a bunch of 95% confidence tests on them on like every one of the flavors. And there's like 20 flavors, and sure enough, they find that one causes acne. But of course, that's equal to the error of their test, right?
Yes.
And if you're doing social sciences and your tools aren't good enough to deal with the data, and you need to publish because you need to get tenure, well, you're just going to be repeating tests until you can get a result based on the fact that you happen to fall into a statistical error.
Yes, everything you just said I agree with, but I want to add a couple of things. Most of the replication crisis, especially within social psychology, it's something like 1/3 of the studies have been shown to be non-replicable. This is done within frameworks that are rooted in social constructionism, psychoanalysis, interpretivism, phenomenology. These kind of they're not rooted in a methodological naturalism. There's an idealism underlying all of it, and it's not really subject to the same kind of scrutiny. As for those that are empirical and which are not reproducible, which you find a lot of the times in certain sectors of the social sciences, I don't know why this is the case, but a lot of them don't seem to know squat about statistics. The Justicar, I don't know if you're familiar with his channel at all.
No, I love his channel. It's really good.
He makes some very good videos, basically decrying some of the things that he sees in the social sciences when he reads their papers. You see somebody saying, for instance, what should I call it? I made the sample size deliberately small in order to minimize the error. This will be said in the abstract somewhere, and it's like, bitch, what are you smoking? Who gave you fucking tenure? So there's.
I know, but this is the thing. I mean, I think this is just the repeatability crisis given a different name. The fact of the matter is that we could verify very few things sociologically to the rigor that we need to pass some kind of muster in, say, physics or chemistry. And so, you can do p-value analysis of this stuff if you want to, and probably very little of it will pass, but it has nothing to do with social constructivism. I agree that social constructivism and a lot of the fads coming out of this Frankfurt School stuff are incredibly damaging, but to me they're damaging more in a philosophical and ethical way, and much less in sort of a we need to get valid social science numbers, because I think the social science numbers are due to the fact that we have poor data sets.
Well, I would recommend you, I don't know if you've read any of Thomas Sowell. He's a favorite of one of mine.
Tons of Thomas Sowell.
All right. His big ass book, Intellectuals and Society, where he basically goes through and shows how time and time again you're going to have people within certain sectors of the social sciences who are going to make these pronouncements about how society ought to be run and what should be done and so and so. And what you see is this kind of repeated pattern of they'll do their studies. They'll do the studies somewhat poorly, as we can see. They're readily available online. We can see what's going on in there. And they're not going to engage in any kind of self-correction when the policies fail. When they engage in all kinds of bullshit, they're going to go back and they're going to revise history and say, yeah, this policy actually did achieve something, even though it didn't achieve the intended result, and it actually ended up making things worse.
Well, I would argue that very few policies in the past that were effective were based on science in the sense that you mean it.
Well,
I mean, to consider, for instance, the cultural policy of discouraging a large... I've had this conversation with Eseth, right? And this is sort of a Burkean argument, and that is society, due to trial and error, has developed a number of intuitions that come to right conclusions far before we have the science to actually validate it. And one of those conclusions, for instance, was that people, and I'm going to be sexist here, but in particular women, it's better for them to have a very low number of lifetime sexual partners. Now, we're just now getting the data to confirm this, but it appears like it's true. But, if you go back to the 1920s, everyone would have told you that, and they wouldn't have had like some kind of double-blind, rigorous study at p-values of, 95% to tell you that that was the case.
Yes, I feel there's a danger here of a naturalistic fallacy. In principle, I can see the point that you're making. It's almost like natural selection. Society tinkers with itself a little bit over time, and it sees these things work, these things don't. And even I'm
saying that traditional institutions are information-carrying mechanisms.
Right. Yes.
I'm not saying that because it comes from a tradition, it's good. I'm saying that tradition should be expected to have some amount of actual information being provided to us by our ancestors.
Yes, and what I'm saying is it should always be open to an ongoing critical scrutiny and discourse.
I would argue we've had very little problem criticizing our traditions in the last 100 to 200 years. That's basically all the Academy has been doing.
They haven't been doing a good job. The methodology that they're using, it's shit. They need to switch to a naturalistic one.
What do you mean? I don't know. I don't buy this. I don't even understand what's the difference between the I understand that's a different name. Are you saying they just need to observe standard statistical practices that they already should know from taking their stats classes?
Well,
I teach statistics. I teach people who do social science. They know how an estimator works. Now, if they go into their fields and don't apply that, then I don't know what to do. But
yeah, I think that's
saying, we've moved your field into a naturalistic framework. I don't see how that's going to help them remember what I've taught them better.
Yeah, this statistics thing is a separate, I think, institutional problem. What I'm getting at is the sort of mode of reasoning they use. I do think that a lot of this constructivism really is central to the way they're appraising the world, the way they're appraising, what kind of media images should we be showing, what kind of government policies should we be implementing. These things typically don't happen in a vacuum. You're going to have activist groups. You're going to have lobbying groups who regurgitate their half-remembered lectures.
So how would you apply? What media images we should show? That was the question you just said a few minutes ago. I mean, you think you're going to run an experiment that passes an institutional review board and has like a 97% confidence with current mechanisms? Is that your standard for admitting it as evidence that this is a database policy?
Not necessarily, because the way you're interpreting the results is embedded within a certain framework. If you are
lower your confidence, right?
Sorry? No. I'm saying change the background assumptions, change the framework that you're operating under. Instead of saying that
I don't understand how that helps. What do you mean change the framework?
Okay. So you have right now the social constructionist framework where everything is discursively constructed, where all of the problems with the world are ultimately due to the fact that we have these institutions that are poisoning our souls.
I understand that is definitely the reigning view in the social sciences.
What I'm saying, okay, but this isn't just the reigning view. This is the basis of everything. What I'm saying is change the basis, change it under a naturalistic framework, change it to embedding our study of society in terms of our natural history. It's not that these institutions we have to recognize they didn't come about in a vacuum. They don't shape human nature. They reflect human nature. Whatever
Sure.
particular differences you have from society to society, or
They
over
do
time.
both, right? They both change and reflect human nature.
I'm a little skeptical as to the extent to which they change human nature. We
Based
don't
on
come.
what? I mean, that's a very general statement to be skeptical of, right?
What I'm saying is we don't come into the world as blank slates. We do
Oh, I
carry with
totally
us.
reject that. You're not
Yeah.
going to have any argument from a traditionalist if you want to reject the blank slate theory. I think that's just trash.
Yeah. What I'm
The
saying is,
question
but
is now, yeah, go ahead.
you have this kind. There's another. Nobody who knows what the blank slate is going to admit that they subscribe to it. I'm not saying that you subscribe to it. I'm just saying that even if you talk to a super ultra progressive person, they're gonna say that the blank slate is a straw man. That's not what they really believe. But a lot of people believe in something functionally equivalent. They believe that human beings are like clay.
Mhm.
That even though we are not necessarily blank slates, we are sufficiently neuroplastic and sufficiently epigenetic to be changeable in whatever manner one desires.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and this is something that I
Large
think.
swaths of the progressive ideology essentially rely on that. Large swaths of
Yeah.
the liberal ideology functionally rely on that.
Well, I would say that liberal ideology, when done correctly, operates in the same manner as my idealized version of the skeptic community. That you have an
I'm
ongoing critical discourse without necessarily subscribing
going to drop a
to a
little bit
particular.
of a bomb here, King Crocoduck, but like you're aware of sort of the hot news that's been going on in the last month involving Kraut and T and the
Yeah.
rest of the alt right.
Mhm.
So I have been known in this channel that I swear absolute agnosticism over the question of races and IQ differences. Everyone who
Sure.
watches this channel knows that I claim no knowledge of this, and I'm a firm agnostic. But if the harder elements of that theory are true in the way that JF Gary Arpey thinks they're true, you can kiss your liberalism goodbye, man.
Not necessarily.
Really?
Yes, really.
I like to see,
Consider as an example.
let's assume that there are two populations that live in the country and they have a standard deviation of IQ differences.
Okay, I don't think it's quite that large, is it? I think it's
No,
something like
but
15 points.
you said that I'm making it up. I'm
Okay.
just I'm pulling this hypothetical thought experiment out of my ass. Everyone who's watching this, I don't believe this is true. This probably isn't true. My
All
my
right,
point is
go ahead.
only to propose a scientific theory that might be true and show how it would just essentially smash liberalism and
It, would- it
instantly.
would certainly pose a lot of challenges. But I think that even if we did show, let's take a case that I don't think is going to be controversial at all. Is there any reasonable person, even among progressives, who believes that old people are not biologically inferior to young people?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
isn't it?
if you want to have a situation in society where certain groups of people through their entire course of their lives based on their ethnicity get treated in the same way that we sort of institutionalize old people. You could call that society many things. You might even call that society humane. But you certainly couldn't call it liberal.
Well, I think again it would have to be open to debate. I think that the hallmark of a liberal society is its commitment to methodological individualism. Its notion that every person um, is the master of their own destiny, is an agent who is responsible for their own action. Um, so I don't necessarily see how this piece of information would destroy liberalism. I can see how it would pose challenges to it. I can see how there would be difficulties with reconciling this with our views of being humane and reorienting our institutions in a operational manner.
It would create a
But
visual racial apartheid of the kind that we saw in pre 1960s America. And it would essentially justify it.
According to the progressive left, we already live in one. They'll say that today.
I'm saying this, whatever the progressives are imagining America looks like in 2017, I'm telling you that if you institutionalize that scientific fact inside a liberal, quote unquote, meritocratic framework, you're going to be getting like 1951 America really in really short order.
But by the same logic, you are also going to have to leave the old people out to die.
I don't follow that logic.
Well, an elderly person who can't take care of themselves, who has to be taken care of by presumably some state official because they don't have a family who cares for them or whatever.
Sure. So you take care of them, right? But you don't expect the same thing from them that you do. You don't expect the same thing from a 75-year-old person with Alzheimer's that you do from a 22-year-old young person finishing college with an IQ of 135. Right? Okay, right. So you have two separate systems for dealing with these two separate people. And you can deal with them as humanely as you want, but you're getting the 1950s separate but equal paternalism.
I don't think so. I don't think that. I think that. Hold on. I think inequality of outcome does not necessarily translate to separate but equal.
If it's radical enough, it does.
Well, the extent to which it's radical, kind of remains to be seen.
I think it doesn't. I mean, why not? We're arguing over a hypothetical fact.
Right.
To me,
I think under any extreme circumstances, if you change the parameters of society enough, impose some extreme enough variable, some liberal values are going to have to go. You can take perfectly.
My hypothetical pulled out of my ass scenario, which is absolutely not true, or maybe it is true. Who knows? I don't know. I just pulled it out of my ass. Was a 1 standard deviation difference. That's radical. That means that two groups unnamed, the lower group would just be totally unrepresented in higher education for the most part. Every now and again, there'd be some scion that would make it in, right?
Sure.
That would be the reality of that situation.
That would, yeah, but we would still treat people as individuals. Whatever differences there are in group outcomes, I'm a liberal. I don't particularly care about that. What I care about is what can the individual bring to the table, and what can society do in order to allow this individual to be as productive as possible.
Well, sure.
How can society invest in the individual in such a manner as to get the most bang for their buck? If there is a difference...
I mean, you're pretending like there's sort of this collective interest that can be easily defined. Bang for the buck presupposes some kind of person who's benefiting. I mean, well, if two groups of people are working in a society, and one group feels like it's the underclass, the bang for society in general is going to be a much less favorable position for that undergroup because they are feeling like they're essentially working for the benefit of the overgroup.
Yeah, but both are going to feel this way to a certain extent. The overgroup is going to feel like they're working and their support is, the institutions that their taxes are going to are going disproportionately to the underclass. And the underclass is going to feel bitter at the upper class because they're going to feel that this upper class has opportunities that they don't. This is just a reality of human life. There's nothing that can be done about this. This is going to exist in every society except maybe communist societies where everybody's poor.
So I'll grant it. I get it. If you could take these two groups and make it so people couldn't see the difference between them, and you destroyed the group identity so that there was no human marker for people to pick up on and sort of like play collective politics, you might be able to run with that kind of society and sort of save liberalism. To me, though, I
want to throw in a caveat.
Practical at this stage, right?
I want to throw in a caveat, though. People will naturally form groups, but the question is, what sort of group should people?
Problems if that happens, right?
Right. There are problems with this, but there are ways of reconciling it. One subscription to individualism need not be atomistic. We don't need to think of society as a collection of individuals in a kind of dog eat dog. I'm looking out for my own interests, and if everybody does this, this is the only way that it's going to work. Obviously, such a society is going to be very unstable. It is possible to subscribe to an individualism where everybody is a member of part of a local community. and these local communities have their own interests, but these interests are not based necessarily upon common, demography, race, sexuality, gender, whatever. Whatever the people in the cities devoted to coal mining, whatever their interests are going to be distinct from the interests of somebody living in a comfortable suburb or in a metropolitan area. These differences are going to be distinct.
Those are class differences. The ones that, the racial and ethnic differences would be much more salient. Class differences are sort of, well, I know Marxists don't agree with this, but class differences, in my view, are kind of, unless you're in a really suppressed society that has almost no upward mobility between generations, if there's at all any upward mobility, class distinctions tend to be a lot more subdued than the other type.
Well, I don't think it would necessarily be a society where it's one class against another. I think it would be more like my own region looking out for its own interests versus that region looking out for its own interests. So you would have the people in the coal city versus the people in the farming city versus the people in so on and so forth. All of these different lower class regions competing with each other, as well as all of the coastal regions competing with each other. These coastal elites, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, Portland. They would not necessarily form one class against this middle America like you have right now. Everybody would sort of be in their own kind of local partitioning as far as their competition with one another is concerned.
This seems, I don't know. This seems. I guess it could work like this. To me, this doesn't seem like it would work like that. I feel like that's sort of this idealized version of how a society like this would be set up and persist.
Well, as I say, you need to, as long as the society has an ongoing critical discourse, as long as people are allowed to engage with one another in conversation over these topics, the society will remain stable. It's only when you have these encroaching...
I totally don't agree with that.
No?
No. Conversations are something that people in the upper class do amongst themselves. They're not social stabilizing elements in and of themselves. Coal miners don't engage in conversations with Black urban people to keep America stable. They're stable because the upper class and the people who create the culture create institutional overstructures that they belong to, and then they're indoctrinated into thinking that they're one collective group called American.
I think we disagree on what I mean by discourse. When I say discourse, I mean that the manner in which we resolve disagreements between groups that disagree.
Does discourse include just like plain indoctrination through media and education?
That could be part of it, but as I say, the discourse ideally
is actually going on.
Ideally, discourse would be critical. People would take responsibility for the media that they consume. People would be critical of whatever it is they take for granted. This is one of the most important parts back to the skeptic community of what we do here. We don't. Ideally, we don't
do only one thing, and that is methodological skepticism, according to your previous definition, right?
Yes, and I think that if society as a whole operated by a similar methodology, you would the strongest ideas would end up surviving, and the greatest number of people would have their interests represented to the greatest extent. It wouldn't be a common interest. Of course, there is a plurality of interests.
So you're maintaining so you're saying under sort of like an idealized liberalism that would result in sort of this utilitarian optimal point. That's your argument, if I got it correctly?
Well, yes, although I should probably go for a negative utilitarian as well, or as a substitute for what I just said. It'll minimize the
negative utilitarian is.
Yeah. Sorry?
Well, negative utilitarian? How is it different from just utilitarian?
The positive utilitarian says greatest amount of good for greatest amount of people, and the negative utilitarian says least amount of suffering for the least amount of people.
Okay, so it's just the minimize the negative as opposed to maximize the positive, different optimization problem. I can deal with that. To me, that's
related, by the way, to the question. It's related, by the way, to the question.
I guess it seems very idealized. I mean, to me, the probability that some very simplified form of liberalism is just sort of like the optimal point on human development. It's so simple as to be very unlikely true, I guess.
Well, I will say this: whatever model you choose to take, whether it's liberalism, conservatism, Nazism, whatever model you choose, every model by its nature is going to be simplistic.
Yeah, of
That's why you
course.
have to have. That's why you have to have the ongoing critical discourse, so that whenever
Hello?
address those, and I think that liberalism is best equipped. It comes prepackaged with this capacity to engage in discourse.
See, I suspect that the reason why skeptics prefer liberalism is because they like liberalism for other reasons. And they're and they like utilitarianism and they like liberalism. I know this sounds like I'm psychologizing you, but it seems to me that you like both of those ideas for different reasons, and we're sort of like hoping that they sort of like that they're meant for each other, right? It
Well,
seems sort of more wishful thinking, I guess, to me. Maybe it's true. I mean, if I see evidence for it, right?
I take a lot of my inspiration from Karl Popper, and in particular his book *The Open Society and Its Enemies*. That had a tremendous influence on me. And
what do you think we've achieved the open society, or we ever will?
The open society, as with any model, as I said, is an idealization. You can only ever attempt to approach it asymptotically.
It's interesting. Have you ever heard of Mencius Mollbug?
No.
Mencius Mollbug, he's a reactionary thinker who had a blog and subsequently retired it. But he talked a lot about Karl Popper's open society, and he thought that this was an interesting idea. And he said it would be interesting to imagine a society as sort of a spectrum between Karl Popper's open society, which I think he calls type 1 societies, and sort of North Korean Stalin like total repressive societies, which he calls type 3 societies. And he postulates that all societies that both of those rarely happen and are mostly unstable in human history. And he thinks the Karl Popper version of the open society is totally unsustainable in history. And he says that most societies maintain some kind of consensus through what he calls a cathedral, right? An institutional consensus among authoritarian organizations, a sense of some legitimate hierarchy.
I think that this is also ultimately unstable, though.
Pardon?
I think this is ultimately unstable as well. If he's correct about the open society being unstable, I think that this traditionalist monolithic society is also unstable.
Yeah. I mean, everything to a reactionary is ultimately unstable, but he thought that an open society would disintegrate in one generation, and then it would take about 10 or 20 to disintegrate. Some society that had some ability to maintain itself culturally. Because I myself, and I think I'm sort of channeling Mollbug here, the big sort of clink in the armor of a totally individualized liberalism of the type that, say, Sargon of Akkad recommends is the point of education. It's the point where you actually have to sacrifice for a generation you'll never see and communicate to that generation of people who is not yet born or who are not yet adults the values of your ancestors who have long since died.
Well, I think Milton Friedman was correct when he pointed out that one of perhaps the greatest incentivizer for any society is the incentive of family. It's not a rational incentive. It's you're not going to live to see, in all likelihood, your grandchildren have their own children and grandchildren, as much as people might really love to see that. But they nevertheless.
Hello, did I drop out there? I'm sorry.
I didn't realize you dropped out. Now I see two of you.
Yeah. Okay. I must. Sorry about that. Okay. What was the last thing you got for me?
You were channeling Mollbug, and then you paused, and then I started talking.
Okay. I said, was it the big clink in the liberal armor is education?
You talked about how people are going to be sacrificing for generations that they ultimately,
yeah, and they'll be communicating them values of their ancestors who are dead.
Yeah, and my
not individuals, and it has to be communicated over a generational gap.
Right. My response to that is that as with this, what I mentioned earlier with the local community thing, it's not really an atomistic individual society. It's really a family society.
Well, I can get on board with that.
Yeah, Milton Friedman pointed out that one of the greatest incentivizers is the family. It's completely irrational. I haven't read Ayn Rand, but I heard that she said the same thing. That there's nothing rational, at least from the utilitarian perspective, of saving up a lot of money and then passing it on to the next generation. There's nothing about that that is good for you.
This seems so. You support families then?
Yes.
That seems traditionalist to me.
Well, as I say,
that's a step back from total individualization.
Right. Right. Well, I want to clarify. My flavor of individualism is not the atomistic one that I think you take Sargon to be holding. My flavor of individualism is one that realizes that we're all what's the term I'm looking for? We're all situated within a certain context. This context is informed by our common natural history, and one of the strongest institutions or contexts, as I was just saying, that motivates us is the family unit.
But do you think the family unit relies on a larger sort of magisterium that sort of people on the traditionalist side would talk about? That the families don't just exist sort of. I mean, families themselves aren't atomized. They exist to a larger culture, to a larger civilization.
Right. Well, families are members of local communities. And with advancements in travel, of course, people are always dreading going to see their families on Thanksgiving. So you do have a bit of a wrench thrown into the system there. But for the most part, families are situated within local communities, and these local communities do have their own distinct interests that are separate from or not completely separate, but they are distinct from other communities containing their own families of families.
Okay, but now we said, well, not only are we admitting the essential role of families, we're also admitting the essential role of some kind of cultural magisterium that supports those families.
Right, but what I'm saying,
the way that the old traditionalist cultures of Christianity and Western European cultures would have before the 1960s.
Okay, the difference being, though, that you have a plurality of cultures, and these cultures are always subject to critical discourse and scrutiny.
Well, but how do you reconcile that with what happened in the 60s, though? We subjected the family to this critical discourse, and we decided we didn't need it. And so our entire intellectual class set aside, most of their careers trying to destroy the very types of societal norms that were really required in order to get a majority of people to marry, settle down, and have children.
Yeah, I think that to a certain extent this is unhealthy. You and I may just disagree on some of the particulars of.
You just showed how taking. I mean, at the end of the day, if I'm able to just go, if I'm able to go up to an institution and go, well, why do you do this? Well, why do you do this? Well, why do you do this? You can break down any institution.
Okay, but here's the thing. When you say, why do you do this? Why do you do this? Why do you do this? Somebody else has to respond for reasons A, B, and C.
Well, sometimes you don't know the reasons. Sometimes the reasons aren't apparent.
Then that's the point of the university. Then that's the point of research.
Okay, but we functionally
the way things have played. Look, I agree with you. The way things played out in the 60s, the way that things played out in the 60s was not necessarily the best. It was critical only to the extent that people were employing critical theory. It was not critical in the sense that people were thinking critically about what was going to happen. That they weren't thinking they weren't submitting their own preconceptions and biases to the same scrutiny that they were submitting society's preconceptions and biases.
It seems like we're commending a state of affairs where you can destroy. It would be like going up to a body and making it work so that I have to think about my heart beating in order for my heart to beat every time. And under those circumstances, the body would just die because at some point I'm going to stop thinking about it. And it's the same thing. If the family has to defend itself against criticism every generation, at some point, I mean, the reason why the family survived as long as it did in Western societies, it didn't have to stand up in the universities and go, oh, hey, this is the reason why people settle down and get married, as opposed to, have 52 partners over the course of their lifetime. Once you do that, you're already in serious difficulty, right?
I think that the families are actually going to grow stronger if they engage into this arena of discourse and critical scrutiny.
Did they? Did they get stronger? Are families stronger now after 50 years of discourse on them that started in the 60s?
Well, who was engaging in the discourse? People were not sitting down and talking to each other about these matters.
Well, I mean, they weren't. I mean, I don't know. You could defend families in the university up until just recently. I just don't know how to reconcile this with what we've seen, in the last 50 or 60 years, I guess.
What I'm saying is the last 50 years, the worst of it, coming from the hardest portion of the left, is not necessarily the healthiest thing. And the reason it's not necessarily the healthiest thing is because they're trying to impose their beliefs by fiat. This is not the same as critical discourse.
What do you mean? No, they're trying to oppose their ideas and fiat now, but that was after 50 years of critical discourse in which they essentially were able to take over the universities with these types of arguments.
Did they though? I mean, because I'm reading through Sol's book, and I'm getting the impression that the worst of them always operated to a certain extent. I mean, now it's exploding. Now you have a lot more people who are engaging in this worst kind of pushing things by fiat. But my impression is that the people like Herbert Marcuse and Richard Rorty and other types like them, they would sort of lock down their universities. If you read
Herbert Marcuse was popular in the 60s, but he wasn't exactly able to compel everyone else in the university to agree with him as much of a celebrity as he was in like 1967.
But he convinced the important people, the people who would go on to set up departments like your ethnic studies departments, your gender studies. Hold on. You set up these ethnic studies departments and these gender studies departments and all of these other departments. And if you read, I forgot the name of the book, but it was written by Nareda Kawertka and Daphne Patai. They were ex-feminist studies professors. What you're going to consistently find is since at least the late 70s and early 80s, these departments have taken on a kind of bunker mentality, where the people who crank out the majority of these terrible ideas are sort of sitting in their own little echo chambers, apart from the rest of the university, and they're not engaging in critical discourse. And this book that I'm telling you about, this was written in the early 90s.
It comes down to you think that you have the ability to sort of like, you have this huge faith in critical discourse, and I just don't have the same faith. The people who engage in these conversations in university, their audience are a bunch of men in their early 20s. Men in their early 20s want to be told that they don't need to get married, consequence-free sex. That's where there's an incentive there, right? And if you have this conversation in this environment with these incentives, I think that there are certain, the critical faculties are going to be overwhelmed.
Well, I think that'll be probably our fundamental point of disagreement. I do think that the society that encourages people to partake in the discourse and not to just impose things by fiat, but to have intellectual courage and mental discipline, that such a society will ultimately thrive.
I think that's a fair statement of our disagreement. I think that is a very fair statement of our disagreement. If I saw evidence of critical discourse really kicking in and winning the day in institutions like this, I might have a position that said, okay, well, we can use the Socratic method to reestablish the nuclear or extended family, as I say, because they're both two sides of the same coin, as sort of the reigning unit in society and sort of and win. But I don't. That's sort of contrary to my experience.
Well, hold on. I wouldn't say that it's necessary for it to be the reigning unit in society. What I'm saying is its existence it should be able to be strong enough to justify its own existence. That the people who partake
Under
in the
what standard, though?
by the standard, by when you have other people who are saying, no, we should all live in collectives, or no, we should all be single our entire lives, or no, we should artificially inseminate everybody, and nobody, will have Plato's Republic. Nobody will know who's each other's brothers or sisters. They should be able to sit down at the table and have a conversation and disagree on these matters. And I think that in the digital age, when a great deal of information is literally right at our fingertips, and we're able to have intelligent conversations on these matters, a society that should be able to wade through all the shit, all the cat videos, all the Alex Jones nonsense. They should be able to wade through all that.
Able to, or actually does.
Well, that is
wish it could do that.
That is the current problem, and I think that ultimately, whatever comes, what's happening right now, that is going to bear out whether I'm.
What's that women's studies professor from Berkeley that's so famous?
Is it Judith Butler?
Judith Butler. Yeah, if Judith Butler were here, and she was like, I think that the ideal society is like a myriad of sexual perversities, and we'll figure out reproduction, and reproduction can just come from the third world, and look, we have that in Berkeley, and Berkeley's rich is all get out, right? So prove to me that this isn't just better than the traditional family.
Sure.
I'm sure she's had that very debate, and Judith Butler still is an authority. And she teaches this. What?
She's an ideologue who comes from these departments that have taken on a bunker mentality. They are also ideologues. Of course, they're going to engage in this circle jerk, and some people are going to have larger boners than others, so they're going to be the ones who they're going to erect. Bit of a messy analogy, I know. But
I feel this though, King Crocoduck, like you seem like these departments that have a bunker mentality. Like in my experience, having gone across a variety of disciplines, in all but the most rigorous types of science, like hard engineerings and hard physics and hard chemistry, and even in some forms of chemistry and physics, in all but the most rigorous sciences, and sometimes even in rigorous sciences, there's just like fads that erupt, like in publishing and in perception frequently.
Yeah, that's something that we have to be cognizant of and address.
Okay, so if a fad erupts, you agree that society can't just end, right?
Sure.
So,
but the fad
erupts,
has to be subject to scrutiny.
That says we're going to tear down the institutional framework of Western society inside sociology departments to the extent that people who think we should tear down the framework of Western society start winning the arguments and publishing. And we have it set up so that whoever wins the arguments immediately gets to have free reign over how we set up our society, like we kind of did in the 60s.
That's not how it should be done.
That's not
what I'm saying at all. You can never establish a sufficient consensus in order to push such a radical agenda. There's always going to be a plurality.
They did.
Okay. But this was pushed from the top down, not from the bottom up. People in
all academic consensuses come from the top down. That's what journals are.
What I'm saying? Yes, but what I'm saying is whatever legislation, whatever changes came, this all came from the top down and not from the bottom up.
But all scientific consensuses come from the top down.
Scientific, yes, but we're talking about social theories right now and how these social theories influence policy.
I thought you said that we should be trying to run these social theories like they were scientific consensuses. Maybe I misunderstood you.
No, not scientific consensuses. But in the manner that it was run in the 1960s, as I was indicating, it was not genuinely scientific. Whatever they're doing with interpretivism, with phenomenology, with psychoanalysis, this does not resemble a scientific process. So when they effectively, when they push these things from the top down and call it scientific, they are effectively pushing it by fiat. People are not really engaging in critical discourse over whether some of these policies are good or not. And
I do think they have in the social sciences, effectively none of it will be scientifically rigorous to the extent that we talk about things being scientifically rigorous in physics.
Well, I think we're going to have a separate conversation about the manner in which we conceptualize these. But what I'm getting at is whatever happened in the 60s was not the result of a society-wide discourse. You have a few people at the top who are trickling these things down and who are they're setting up lobbies, they're setting up focus groups.
Those two statements were incoherent. Scientific discourse. Okay. Scientific discourses do come from the top down and do trickle down.
Yes.
Okay, so the fact that they came from the top and trickled down should have no bearing on whether this was a scientific discourse or not. Because
there
that's how scientific consensus is.
There are two problems. If the consensus is not a scientific one, then it shouldn't come from the top down. And what I'm saying is it was not scientific.
No, scientific consensuses do come from the top down.
No. Here, you're not listening to me. The social consensus that was reached in the social sciences.
What's a social consensus?
What you're calling the scientific consensus. What I'm saying, this consensus in the social sciences that came from the top down was not genuinely scientific. Therefore, it was fiat.
No social theory will ever be scientifically legitimate.
Okay, I disagree.
Okay, can you give me an example of a scientifically legitimate social theory we have that's been proved to the rigorousness of physics?
Well, when we talk about proof to the rigorousness of physics, I think we're disagreeing on. There's a whole separate conversation that comes with this. I wish we had more time. But I would say that, for instance, something like evolutionary psychology is markedly superior to social psychology in terms of its scientific rigor and its explanatory capabilities.
I don't know. I'd have to see the evidence. I guess you could say that this paper, which was published from an evolutionary psychology perspective, is more rigorous than this paper that came from a social constructivist. But I don't know. I mean, to me, what I feel like we're doing is we're saying this field cannot generate confidence. So let's just say whatever turns out to be right was the proper scientific consensus, and then sort of backcast, look into the past and say, oh wow, they didn't do science because they were wrong. But the people who were right.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is their process is fundamentally flawed. Whatever conclusions are reached by psychoanalysts, by phenomenologists, by interpretivists, they may or may not be correct. Most of the time they're garbage, and most of the time they're not replicable.
Most of the time, evolutionary psychology's results aren't replicable.
Well, this was the case back when it was just starting, but it's gotten a lot better. In all fairness, there was a lot of garbage that started out.
I've seen a lot of garbage coming from that. I'm taking your word that it's gotten a lot better, and it probably has, right? But this is the thing. I mean, I don't know. To me, I feel that I'm just cautious that we're sort of going to be making similar mistakes in a different way, right?
What I'm saying is the problem with the 60s, whatever problems did emerge, whatever problems came from this consensus that dripped down from the top down, it was arrived at by a process that was not genuinely. I don't want to use the word science here. There was not a genuine discourse taking place.
Okay, I think we've isolated the thing. You think that we both agree that there was a mistake being made, and I am much more skeptical of the process and think that decisions this way, I think that there's going to be a very, very high error rate, even if it is done, quote unquote, properly. And you seem to think that we have a solution where we can do this kind of stuff properly. But I mean, we're not going to resolve that here. But I think that's a disagreement that we have in front of us.
Right. I think the question, okay. if I can rephrase it, we disagree on whether the process that the skeptic community ideally uses to evaluate a position, the process used by genuine academics to arrive at a conclusion, this process is not sufficient to sustain a society in the long term. I
totally agree with that.
Okay. I think it is.
Okay, you think it is? Mm-hmm. I mean, it hasn't been in the past.
I'm saying it hasn't been implemented in the past.
It just became available to us. We've just developed a mechanism for analyzing social phenomenon such that we can base our society on it in ways that we never have before.
I'm saying that it's not necessarily that the process was just developed. The process has been around for thousands of years. It's just that you can't impose these broad sweeping changes from the top down. It has to be piecemeal. Popper spoke in The Open Society and Its Enemies, and I think later in what was it called, Conjectures and Refutations, about piecemeal social engineering, where you change a little piece of society and you see what the results are over a certain period of time. And if things are good, then you keep it. And if things are bad, then you get rid of it and you try something else.
Okay, so let's segue this conversation. We've tried the social experiment of the 60s sexual culture, and I think have manifest evidence. Well, hold on, let me finish the question. Now I think, I have certainly a lot of social science evidence, if you care to hear it, that this has been a manifest failure. Would you agree with that?
I did hear your debate with Christy Winters, so I'm aware of both sides of this issue, but I can't say one way or the other which is correct.
I'd say that the overwhelming amount of evidence is that.
Well, of course, that was your position in the debate.
So you would maintain that high numbers of sexual partners and family disintegration aren't tightly linked?
I would say it's still an open question.
Huh. Well, I would say that the amount of evidence we have on that is, insofar as conclusions in social science, would you agree that there has been a large amount of family disintegration? Christy Winters questioned that.
Has there been a large amount of family disintegrations? There may be. I have seen numbers from both sides, and I can't really determine. I haven't looked into it deeply enough to determine which numbers are bullshit and which ones are legit.
So you look at our society, and you're not even so sure that the sexual revolution changes have been a failure.
Well, I'm not sure which changes have been negative and which ones have been neutral.
Okay. But so you look at society, and you know something is wrong, but you don't know what's wrong.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what the cause of the problems are. I can't pinpoint. It's easy to point to this decade in the 60s.
Isn't this the whole reputation of your entire Karl Popper view? Your entire Karl Popper view was like, we do something, we see that it's wrong, we see why it's wrong, and then we change what made it wrong. If you're sitting here after 50 years of the social science evidence and your reaction is still, something's wrong, but I don't know, then the entire idea that you can change society in this analytical way goes out the window.
Distributors. I'm not a social scientist, so I haven't looked into this to the extent that a social scientist might have. But if I were a social scientist and I had looked into this to the extent that they had, then I would be able to come to the conclusion one way or the other. What I'm saying is what I know right now about whatever transpired in the 60s and 70s. All I have is this kind of broad. Okay, so there was all these changes to all of these institutions, and now we have all of these effects.
Yes.
I can't link the precise cause to the precise effect because I haven't looked into this to the extent that a social scientist would.
And at a highly rigorous level, you probably never could. At the rigor you would need for something like electrical engineering or my own field or physics, you never could. But this becomes the main critique of this Karl Popper view, that you can do this incremental change and analyze it scientifically. At the space you are right now, your ability to actually confront any of the consequences of the scientific revolution is a rapidly declining political force. Your ability to fix this problem is going down the tubes.
Sorry, you said the scientific revolution. Did you mean the sexual revolution?
The sexual revolution, pardon me. The effect of the sexual revolution, pardon me. Our ability to sort of turn back the trends of the 60s at this stage is becoming harder and harder every year.
Oh no, there's no going back.
Okay, but the material conditions will never allow it. Then, if you can't go back after you do something and it massively impacts society in your negative way, then the idea that we can tweak these little knobs, like Karl Popper said, must be false.
There's a false equivalency here. There wasn't any tweaking of little knobs in the 60s and 70s. From what I understand, people were punching all the dials and turning all the knobs all the way. These were not incremental changes by any stretch.
How could you do incremental changes and test things? Like in a controlled environment? How would that even work?
That I'm not entirely sure about. You would. I haven't developed.
This is why I don't buy this.
Hold on. I haven't
right now why I don't buy this approach to social analysis, because you don't have controlled environments in which to apply these scientific methods.
Distributors, hold on. I don't have a comprehensive process for how exactly the social sciences should operate. I don't pretend to. What I'm saying is that the current framework that is being utilized and the framework that has been utilized since even before the 60s sexual revolution that this framework is garbage and that it needs to be replaced with a better framework. And I'm proposing as a better framework to be a naturalistic one. What exactly this means, we could go into for hours, but right now, for our current purposes, my main thesis is that an ongoing critical discourse is what is capable of sustaining a society that appears to be in decline.
And I'm just pointing out that our inability to answer the fundamental questions I asked 5 seconds ago demonstrates why this critical discourse approach to these issues is fundamentally flawed.
I'm not the person to ask about the sexual revolution, though. I'm not the person to ask about the sexual revolution. I'm not a social scientist. And if you did ask a social scientist,
the fundamental questions weren't specifically about the sexual revolution. The fundamental questions that I didn't hear an answer for was how you incrementally change something in society, get an observation, and then rigorously decide to turn back the change in any way that could be actually practiced in society overall, as we have society right now. And that question was unanswered. To which point I say, I can give an example. Very basic questions.
I can give you an example of how it could work.
Okay, I'm willing to hear that.
Okay. Change the let's pick some milquetoast basic thing, taxes. Change the manner in which taxes are done, which are done every 4 to 8 years, and see what the results are, and be able to determine from that which solutions at the very least don't work.
Okay,
so
but
in the future, when people propose their new tax plans, they'll be able to say, okay, this approach was bullshit, this approach was bullshit, that approach was bullshit, this one did a little bit better, let's try that, but let's tweak things a little bit and see how that goes.
I can think of counterexamples why that doesn't work. I mean, stimulus packages will always give you a boost in like a 3-year period. So if I were to use that methodology to test that, I would be like, I'm going to have a $1 trillion stimulus package every time, right? Because that's what's shown in these little 3-year increments to be good.
But in the long term, you're going to build up a massive deficit.
Yeah, exactly. But the experiment didn't take that into consideration.
Okay, then there was a problem with the experiment. You have to, of course, if you don't take all the factors into account, you're going to end up with shit results. I mean,
you can't. That's the problem. That's the problem I'm trying to isolate here, right? Now, I'm harping on this a little bit too much. I think I've made my point. But the thing is, in rigorous science like physics, you can more or less isolate the factors, but in social science, you can't.
Okay, what I'm saying is it isn't necessary to isolate them. When I say you have to take all of the factors into account, I don't mean every last one. I mean all of the ones that are going to produce non-negligible results.
Which you'll have no way of controlling in a complex system like we're talking about.
Okay, but if you're not going to account for something as basic as the trade deficit, I mean, the person who fails to do that,
deficit, but yeah,
right, the fiscal deficit. If a person isn't able to account for that when they're doing this model, they shouldn't have the job.
Okay, but they can't. Our ability to model these things is incredibly limited. Anyway, let's move on. I think we both made our points. I'll say this. What do you see sort of as the role of the skeptic community, and what do you see as the big problems in the world today, I guess? Are you someone who would be more like Sargon and people like Lauren Southern, who sees the emergence of progressivism and perhaps demographic change?
I see. Well, I see in the world one big problem is a rise in authoritarianism. People sort of and I don't mean to point fingers, but people see the promises of the 90s to be an utter failure.
I'm one of them, by the way.
Yeah, I know. That's why I said I'm not going to point fingers. But
yeah,
they see the promises of the 90s to be an utter failure, and they decide to fall back onto more traditional, I guess, what they perceive to be more safe options. And then on the other hand, you have people who say that the failures of the 90s, the failures of the promises of the 90s were due to us not being sufficiently progressive. And so they become progressive to the point of being authoritarian. And so you have this kind of pincer squeezing in on liberalism, and people like me are trying to hold the center. So that's sort of my problem.
And you think that liberalism as it's being practiced, well, as it was practiced in the 90s, is if we stayed the course on that, the problems we had would be minimized, I guess.
I would say that my answer is always going to come back to critical discourse. As long as you have people who are willing to engage in conversation and talk about these issues, and try to be rigorous in their critique of their opponents, as long as you have a state of affairs where this is possible and where people are willing to do this, you will ultimately end up with a better society. The question is, how do we get people willing to do this? And that I see as being the main problem. The problem is it's possible that human nature doesn't accommodate this. It's possible that we are too tribalistic to be able to have such a society, and that it will ultimately break apart because people are going to form their own little gangs of, oh, I belong to this ideology, that ideology, that ideology, and they're all gonna fuck everything up.
And one of the reasons why people aren't so hot on the 90s approach is that we don't have the low unemployment rates of the 90s. We don't have the high growth rates of the 90s. We don't have the demographics of the 90s. If you implemented your policy preferences, would you predict that the growth rate, the employment rate, and the demographic situation in the 90s would also be restored? Or would those things be more like today, and the policies would sort of fix things in other ways other than impacting those three things?
I would say that the demographics matter only to the extent that the cultures matter. If you have, there's a garbage fucking thing heading my way. There's a Sargon and his crew of garbage humans. Fuck, what was I saying? Right. As far as demographics are concerned, the main problem, as I see it, is the culture that's being diffused. If you have people bringing in a culture that is antithetical to the kind of values that I'm trying to bring to the table, a plurality of interests that are all engaging in a critical discourse, then this does threaten the structure of the society. And back to my Karl Popper, he called this the paradox of toleration. When you have, you're probably familiar with it, but when you have people who threaten,
you can't tolerate intolerance, and that's a very crude way of putting it. But I think that was sort of like the layman.
Yes,
right?
Although a lot of people misinterpret what he meant by tolerance, progressives especially. When he said tolerance, he meant people who are willing to tolerate dissenting opinions. So even though, for instance, Antifa might call themselves tolerant in that, oh, I love gay people and black people and whatever, they are not tolerant in the sense that Popper said, in that they're not tolerant of other people expressing their own concerns if they contradict Antifa's concerns.
I mean, the big irony about this is the problem of the modern world. I mean, it essentially can't be due to people like me, because as much as I think that the promises of the 90s were fundamentally false, your big obstacle to implementing anything comes from institutional blocks at the university level, which were put in place largely due to people who were trained and came of age in the 90s.
Yeah, they were taught poorly, I think. I mentioned these bunkered departments that started taking hold at the beginning of the 80s and end of the 70s. The book is called Professing Feminism, the one that talks about this, by Daphne Bataille and Nareta Kawartka.
What is the book cover again?
It was written in the early 90s. And it was basically predicting things that would happen down the line, things that are happening today, and tracing the history of these departments and their developments, and how they adopt this bunker mentality, and they've infected the university, and brought us to this current state of affairs. Whatever nonsense was proliferated over social media and through the institutions, and whatever, these people come from the universities. They were at least partially trained by these departments. They were inculcated with this closed ideology, that's antithetical to the open society. And they're at the same time they're provoking reactionary forces on the far right with their bullshit antics. And now you have this pincer closing in on liberalism.
The problem, liberalism is a contract, right? If someone who's fundamentally culturally opposed to me says, well, okay, it's all right to make fun of Jesus, but not all right to make fun of Muhammad. The idea of freedom of expression is fundamentally dead. It applies only against my particular group. And am I going to be, dying to protect a freedom of expression that privileges somebody else? Probably not, right? Or why should I?
at that point, freedom of expression is not being honored. In order for there to be freedom of expression, you have to be you have to be free to criticize Muhammad and Jesus and Vishnu and all the other fuckers. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, but this is the problem, right?
The problem is people. Yeah, people. It's funny, we were talking about Marcuse and the problem of toleration. For this specific issue, people misunderstand toleration because of an essay Marcuse wrote. I won't go into detail, but basically it comes down to if it does harm to people, and apparently words can harm people, then ultimately we should not be able to tolerate it. But yeah, that's a bit of a digression.
But I guess
people,
the reality you have to deal with right now is that, for the most part, immigrants that are coming into Western Europe and America are not getting assimilated into some kind of rigorous idea of liberal culture. I mean, if you look at the opinion polling, and I don't know how much you trust this, right? Because to me, this is the opinion polling is less reliable than a poll than the research we have showing, say, that there was a decline in families. But if you do look at opinion polling and you do trust it, we see that there's been a marked decline in the belief of freedom of expression and free speech as a percentage of the population, and in particular, a percentage of the college-educated population.
Mm-hmm. They're not being inculcated with liberal values.
Not been maintaining this condition.
Right, but they're not being inculcated with liberal values, and therein lies the problem. The moment things,
no, I know they're not.
Right, it seems to me that whatever.
Why do you think they're not?
It's because of these entrenched departments within the institutions and the poisonous ideology that is slowly infecting much of academia.
This is incredible. It sounds like this liberal system is an incredibly fragile one, right? Like in one generation, it gets fundamentally destroyed.
Well, that's because the source of it is the university, and if you infect the source, you effectively compromise the entire system, and that's pretty much what's happened.
It's kind of funny how Christian sexual ethics lasted for thousands of years. And as soon as we got rid of those and replaced them with pure liberal values, they died in one generation. I mean, it's almost like we kind of validated the Mulbuggian view that these sort of open values aren't sustainable for more than one generation.
But there was no discourse is the problem. As I said, these things were imposed by fiat.
But can there be a discourse once we have these, once we get rid of the underlying values? I guess.
Well, therein lies the source of our disagreement. I think ultimately, because of the incentives provided by the family, they can.
I mean, what I'm sort of missing here, right? What I'm sort of missing here is some scientific explanation of why if this Karl Popperin, society is so good and so ultimately utilitarian for all parties involved. Just like I'd say to the communist, right? If communism is just so good and so awesome, how can we explain why it hasn't emerged, given that it's had so many people that have wanted to bring it about?
Well, because it's, as with all models, as I said, it's a simplified model. You can, even when you do classical physics and you have this super simple model of a block sliding down a wedge, you make all these assumptions. It's in a perfect vacuum. It's completely frictionless. The temperature has no effect on the system. But of course, in the real world, that's bullshit. There's always going to be something that...
and by the way, I cut in here. I know I interrupt you, but I would choose a real world rule of thumb over a super simplified scientific model that takes out friction and air resistance every single time.
You're not going to be able to. Improve the model, though.
Well, no, I mean that model where we take out friction and air resistance, that can stay in the universities and develop itself and not impact with my actual practical day-to-day life. But if I'm designing something that actually needs to function in the real world, like e.g. a society, I'm going to go to the person who actually experienced it and say, okay, how does it actually work? Let's do that. Let's build off what actually works, rather than going to this very abstract notion of these balls moving around in a frictionless, airless space.
But you always have to begin with a very simplified model, and then once you understand the simple model, you can begin adding more and more variables to it to make it more realistic. That's kind of how it goes.
No, it's not how it goes. I mean, it goes. Look, I'm a theoretician. I fully respect. Like the stuff I do for my research is never going to get implemented. It's the music of the spheres, right? Like, no, but there's I kind of keep them separate, right? I mean, I think there's a place for music of the spheres, and there's a place for realism. And
Okay,
I have a huge skepticism where we try to confuse the two of them. And I feel like something like that's kind of going on right now, right?
I don't think the two are necessarily quite as disconnected as you're suggesting. I'm doing my own research as well, and I would basically I've done in this paper I just finished yesterday actually. What I did was I started with a simplified model, and I added more and more variables to it, and made it much more complex. And in the end, it's going to be tested. The experimentalists are going to actually be collecting data, and they're going to see how well the model that I've developed manages to predict their data. If it does a better job than previous models, then they're going to use that, and they're going to introduce more and more variables based on whatever input they've received. And I think that
this doesn't demonstrate anything to do with the proposition, right? That's exactly what my research is going to do too, right? But that doesn't.
But I began with a simplified model. I began with a simplified model, though.
Can't I mean, every now and again you get an abstract model that can actually do this, but for the most part, you don't start with first principle and derive physics to figure out how cement mixing works.
Okay, I think I'm getting at what you're describing. Dennett calls this competence without comprehension. So like for beer making, for beer development and cheese making, these have been around for thousands of years. We've gotten very good at beer making and cheese making over those thousands of years. But it was only within the last 200 years that we understand the processes.
So if I'm like Louis Pasteur, right, and I've just discovered how fermentation works. I don't know if Pasteur actually was one to discover it, but someone like him around his time would undoubtedly discover how fermentation works. Do I take that discovery, kick down the doors of the Guinness beer factory, and go, I've just discovered how the bacteria works. I'm going to totally rewrite all your processes. Don't even explain to me how this works or how it worked for you for hundreds of years, because you don't even know how bacteria works. And just
now he's not engaging in critical discourse.
Well, I'd argue that.
Look, let me ask you this. Do you think that the discovery of the processes of cheese making and fermentation have had no effect whatsoever on our ability to produce better quality beer and cheese?
No, they certainly have. They certainly have to a certain degree, right? But I guess to my mind, these are two horses that need to be kept together and in their separate places. And I'm very sensitive to, like, have you ever read Nassim Nicholas Taleb?
Have I seen what?
Have you ever read Nassim Nicholas Taleb?
No.
You should totally. He wrote the Black Swan and Misunderstanding Randomness. He was I think it would be fair to call him a statistician.
Okay.
But he wrote about how he said, for the most part, in his experience, the danger was always the theory kind of clouding the view of what was actually going on in the real world. It's kind of funny because I thought that in this conversation I would be defending abstract metaphysical concepts of truth over empiricism. But I think that it's actually kind of turned out the exact opposite. I think now I'm kind of defending just experience with the world over this abstraction.
I think you need both. And the two have to be able to talk to each other.
So what would you propose going forward? You said you do think that these trends in the university are really dangerous, and how would you propose to deal with it? How do you think we're going to fix the problem?
Well, first, there has to be widespread societal attention to it. People take it for granted that scholars are like saints, that, if the scholar says it's true, then it must be true. And this is unfortunate because it reduces our capacity to engage in critical discourse if people can sort of impose things by fiat. Bill Nye can show up on a stage with that lady singing the vagina song, and people will clap. So
I mean, I would,
there.
I would argue that was no more scientific than Bill Nye's work on global warming.
Uh, Bill Nye's. I don't know what Bill Nye's work on global warming is though.
Well,
So I
it's
can't.
been basically to show up on a stage and go mug global warming, with no attention to the caveats, basically.
Okay, fine. I agree with that. Although I do think, as I think you mentioned in a previous hangout, you and I both agree that global warming is a thing.
We both agree it's a thing. I think that it can be a thing, and our academy has been dishonest about how it's presented. Those two things can both be simultaneously true.
Okay, fine. I can accept that. But what I'm getting at is the first has to be people need to point out the emperor is naked. And there are a variety of ways this can be done. I'm currently engaged in one project, but I'm keeping it a little bit close to the chest. Let's just say that.
Fair enough. And I should say, I really respect. I feel like some people in the chat are saying that there's been kind of this hint of anger in my voice. I just want to say, man, like I'm listening to you in this conversation, and you've been very reasonable, and your approach to this whole thing has been really good. It's actually the proximity of your view to mine that leads me to kind of get frustrated, if that makes sense. Like your view of the world and my view of the world are so similar that that the sort of critical difference, the critical fundamental skepticism I have to discourse, it makes that difference all the more frustrating. And the fact that we can see it, we can agree that that's the difference, makes it even more frustrating to me. So I just want to say to the chat, I just want to communicate my respect, right?
Yes. I respect you too, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation. Even I don't take any issue with your tone. I'm a big boy, so
yeah, no, it's fine. It's just me being sort of skeptical and pessimistic about the discourse thing. But keep on going. I think we're kind of sorry. I guess my question was just how do we just deal with the situation that we're in currently? Because it seems to me, he's a pessimist right now.
Well, as with all things, it's got to be one step at a time. You got to take baby steps. There may be a time limit in terms of immigration problems, encroaching authoritarian forces, and all of these other things. So, of course, that has to be taken into account. But no grand sweeping solution is possible, I think. That you have to take baby steps. And these baby steps primarily have to be with regard to the university, how it's perceived, how it functions, and the scholars, whether they are held accountable or not.
Okay, yeah, that's. I mean, I think we both agree. You and I probably both have on the top of our list, or top of things that piss us off, is the sort of academic abuse that's been going on in the social sciences, and in a lot of the a lot of our approaches to dealing with things like privilege and bias and all of these things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whatchamacallit? So, as I said, the exact methodology or one of the methodologies that I'll be part of, let's just say there's going to be Alan Sokol is going to have a very good laugh in a not very distant future.
By the way, Alan Sokol, for people who are watching, he was I think he was a physicist that submitted a phony paper that was dressed up to sound like postmodern critical theory Frankfurt School type research, and he got it accepted in a sociology journal, even though he just made up shit and didn't have any background in the subject.
Yeah, and they ended up with egg on their face. It was a very embarrassing moment. So,
but I'll say this: that happened 20 years ago, just to put things in perspective.
Yes. So imagine if
the Sokol hoax, as sort of cathartic as it was, facilitated no change in any of these fields to speak of.
Yes, exactly. So imagine if 20 or so years later, a much larger scale of it were to repeat, and it would suggest that there has been no progress over the course of 20 years. In fact, maybe things have gotten worse. But I'll say no more on the subject.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, but you can kind of perhaps get a feel for the direction that I'm going in. You have to first. I hate using this term. You have to red pill people to the reality of the academy.
I like that term a lot.
I say it with the same tone that I say woke. The left say woke, the right say red pilled. I just want to.
Well, it's the same thing, right? We're both saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with the core assumptions. So, see, I'm a person who thinks that something fundamental is wrong, right? And I really sympathize. I'm not saying this just to like suck up. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? But man, I just recognize my thinking patterns so much in what you've been telling me in this conversation, right? But over the last 10 years, I've looked at society and I've grown much more skeptical about this entire project that we've undertaken to have this kind of quote unquote discourse. I would use the exact same terms. And I've come to think a little bit more along the lines of, well, not so much that we ever were working towards a discourse, but we had sort of this thing called a civilization that we were building on, and the pillars got knocked out from under it. And that's sort of been my thinking. And it was sort of like a red pill moment for me.
Yes,
it was sort of, I understand your skepticism of it, but it was sort of a questioning of an assumption I had going forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your perspective, and I think it's an interesting one. I think you've articulated it very well in your videos. It has gotten me thinking more carefully about some of the challenges to liberal secular democracy and how they could potentially be addressed. Ultimately, I'm going to continue falling back upon, and I'll use the same term, critical discourse, until I recognize that human nature or whatever you want to call it, whatever you think is the problem, whether it's human nature or the institutions, something is going to fundamentally make it not work. Until that day, though, I am going to continue saying that ongoing discussion is not going to lead to any kind of permanent solution. There's never going to be a day where we're all satisfied, or indeed any of us are satisfied with everything. But it is going to be sustainable in the long term, is my current position. And I know you disagree with that, but I guess this was a good talk for sort of articulating our differences and
I see. So just to put, I see that sort of the demographics that are going on in the West and the trends in opinion polling, both from Western populations and the introduction of non-Western populations, are creating a situation where the desire for this kind of discourse is it's the embers of it are slowly dying away. And this is the last generation under which it will be conceivable that any kind of solution like this will even be possible. No, I would love it if you guys could fix this problem. But to me, in order to fix this problem, it would require you to essentially destroy every single sociology department, rewrite them from the ground up, and create totally new institutions. And you'd have to accomplish this in the course of a 20-year period. So
yeah, that sounds approximately
elapsed from the original Sokol hoax. They would think it was I think it actually was 20 years ago. I think it was 1997, right?
Yeah, 96.
Okay, it was almost there. If another 20 years elapses and the same thing has happened in the academy has happened over the last 20 years, you have missed your window for fixing this problem. Because I think at that point, demographically, if these trends continue, demographically and opinion-wise, there will not be a large demographic constituent who will want to even achieve what you're trying to go for.
Yes, I agree. I as I mentioned earlier, I am cognizant of this. There is limited time. When I was talking about the baby steps, it is a monolithic project, and I have no delusions that this is going to be achieved tomorrow or even within the next decade.
I would say this: I hope you were right. I hope your project succeeds, and I see you as sort of fundamentally an ally. And I'll say this: in the event that your project does not succeed, I see sort of the reactionary thought as sort of a hedge.
Well, I go wherever the evidence goes, and if the evidence were to ever head in that direction, then of course I would change.
But don't you hedge against your beliefs? I mean,
Don't I
what if
what?
you're wrong, right? Like, okay, you think that critical discourse can save the West,
Hmm.
right? But if critical
Yeah.
discourse can't save the West, wouldn't it be wise to kind of invest in an alternative?
Well, I guess that just remains to be seen. I don't know if
Well, we
this
don't know. I don't
alternative.
know, right? Like, I don't know.
So,
Maybe critical discourse will save the West. In which case, Godspeed, as Razor Fist would say, God fucking speed. And that's what I would say to you, right? If critical discourse can save the West, like I am praying for you. I'm with you 100%, right? And if it does end up saving the West, I will be very, very, very happy, right? But
yes.
I'm asking
Either way,
people and think,
either way,
what
I
is
will
it
have to get back
best,
to you in 20 years
right?
on this. I'm happy that we agree on the scale of such a project and
Yeah.
and the urgency of it. And I'm happy that you're not opposed to it in principle. It's just that
No,
it seems.
not only am I not opposed to it, I think it would be awesome.
Well, that seems like a good note to end on. Then,
Yeah,
shall we
no,
wrap up?
I have to wrap anyway. Man, again, people in the chat, if people think I sounded angry or contentious, it was not because King Crocoduck was wrong. I think we sort of isolated our disagreement, and he's an awesome YouTuber. So, everyone, please
Yes,
go sub to
likewise.
his channel.
Yes, likewise to you, distributist. I'll send people on my social media to your
Yeah.
direction.
Again, I think we are engaged in a discourse here, and we have one central contention, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. I'm sure we're going to be having more conversations in the future.
No doubt.
So, with that, I thank you all, and I apologize again for the changes in time that we put our viewers through. That's just a function of the holiday season. And thank you again so much, King Crocoduck, for stopping by and making time in your busy schedule. I'll see you guys all on future live streams. I'm sure I'm going to have more of them. It seems to be sort of a holiday thing to do. And have happy celebrations, Christmas, and holidays all around. Have a good night.
Have a good one.